afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate. Thanks for joining Lusk Perspectives. And I'm very pleased to welcome our guest today, Claudia Sahm. I've had the pleasure of knowing Claudia for it's going to be 6 years, actually. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine. As I got to work with her when I was a senior advisor to Secretary Castro at HUD. We had a standing meeting every couple of weeks called Housing Deputies, where I would see her. And as insightful as I found her then, I find her even more insightful now, because the problems that I hear her grappling with are even more serious problems than the ones we were dealing with 5 and 6 years ago. So Claudia has a distinguished resume, a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, a longtime staffer at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and has very piquant and, I think, well-founded views about the state of the macroeconomy and what we should be doing about it, which of course is something everybody in the real estate business cares quite a lot about. So with that, Claudia, thanks again for being with us. It's been almost exactly a year since last you were with us. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Yeah, no, and it's been quite a year. And actually the talk that I gave a year ago was talking about the economy was in free fall. Some relief had come out from Congress. The Fed was moving, but we had not started to see the recovery that was taking shape late last spring, early in the summer. We made a lot of progress out of a very deep hole, and we went sideways, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And then again, at the beginning of this year, there was a big push from Congress. All of these fiscal responses, all of the Federal Reserve responses, I have been a big proponent of, because I knew we were in a very serious situation as the COVID crisis began, and we still are. So the talk that I'm giving today is a really different one. It's me reflecting on both my experiences at the Federal Reserve during the Great Recession and the very slow recovery. I showed up right before it all went south, and my first forecast at the Fed covering consumer spending was in January of 2008. So I thought a lot about what the Fed missed, both before the crisis, before I got there, and importantly, what I saw as time went on, both at the Federal Reserve and knowing what fiscal policy was doing. That's been a big focus of my research for now well over a decade, on how Congress and the administration try to help families during recessions. So that put me in a good place as I had left the Federal Reserve and was working on economic policy, advising members of Congress as COVID struck. And so this past year has been a whirlwind. I mean, it's been a real privilege to get to work on these policies. And it's what I'm going to share with you today are the changes, the sea change in economic policy that we are living right now. And, this is urgent, right? It's now or never. So I think there's a lot of encouraging developments, and I think there's some worrisome or, just things we really have to think hard about. Okay, so just while I got your attention right at the beginning, I'm going to share the high level, the takeaways, and then we're going to walk through each of these in turn. Now you're going to, if the first glance at the slide, and this is totally intentional, is you will see the word new all over the place. So most encouragingly, we are starting to have a new awareness about problems that have been with us in the economy long before COVID, but were definitely exacerbated in COVID. And that has led, and also the experiences after the Great Recession has led policymakers to think about new goals. Like we just need to, the goal lines need to be set in such a way that we really do solve the problems, the disparities in our economy. Now, once you got goals set, these are, many of them, we'll talk about them, are much harder than the goals policymakers had set before. So you got to try some new tools, you got to try new frameworks. We've been living this over the past year and continue to, as President Biden has put 2 more big proposals on the table, the jobs plan and now the families plan. There's a lot of experimentation in there, and that's really exciting. Now, the last point is new is hard, right? Especially brand new programs. There were some stood up in the COVID crisis. Some of them worked really well and some of them didn't. And new creates a lot of uncertainty. We don't know. I mean, the entire COVID crisis has been plagued with uncertainty, and in terms of the economy, the virus, and then we start using new tools, that adds another layer. And the last point, and this is one I feel like I have been living rather intensely since the beginning of the year, is new has enemies. And I don't mean this in the sense that like they just hate change, though change is hard. And when it pushes us into uncharted territory, there are plenty of people who will jump up and down and tell us why it's too risky. So, it's good to have a debate, but at some point it gets a little old. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of new awareness, and I want to be clear, this is awareness among a very broad swath of the economy, like racism, systemic, not just at the individual level, but at our institutional level, our labor markets, our government policies, has been with us since before the founding of this country. But we are getting to a point where white Americans, white policymakers are finally really grappling with this. And, COVID, I mean, this was absolutely obvious before COVID. And yet, in this crisis, both with the pandemic, the health effects, and the economic effects have been felt disproportionately by Black, Hispanic workers. This is also true for some Asian workers, Native Americans, right? So there was a really tragic impact on many dimensions. And then we saw a lot of social upheaval and violence against Black people. I mean, so like all of this really came to a head in the last year. So we're aware of it. This is the first step. This is not enough to solve it, but we are talking about it. The one example I'm showing you here are the unemployment rates for Black workers, Hispanic workers, and white workers. Over the entire history, Black workers' unemployment rate is about twice white workers, and Hispanic is about 1.5%. You can look there at the end of where we're at with the COVID crisis. I mean, it's just the peaks in those lines are just incredible, particularly for workers of color. And you can see that even after all this recovery, all this like progress we've made, the Black unemployment rate is well over 9%. The Hispanic unemployment rate is close to 8%. So like we are nowhere near done. And these gaps look just like they do historically in terms of about twice and 1.5. Okay, so another place that we've seen in this recession, and actually this one was so unique to the way the recession happened, it was referred to often as a woman recession because the industries, the service sector, those were hit very hard by the need to social distance, and those are industries that women tend to work in. And then layered on top of that, we saw increased burdens on parents, especially ones with small children who had daycares closed, school closed. And not only did many of them lose jobs, but many millions left the labor market. Right, so they're not working and they're not looking for a job because they have a job at home, making sure that their, kids and other family members are safe and life goes on. And what you can see is early in the crisis, a lot of people dropped out, right? And this was true women, men, mothers, fathers, right? Like what has really happened as the recovery has gone on are the disparities have widened, and in particular even though schools are reopening and daycares, like this isn't across the board. It's not, I mean, my children are only in school 2 days a week. That's true for a lot. And some parents don't feel comfortable having their children in school at all. And so what you've seen is that mothers are still, that decline in the labor force participation is still there. I mean, that can have very long-term effects on their careers. And it also emphasizes that what parents need, the support they need, is different than the rest of the population. So, I mean, these are not new problems. We know about this, but it has, again, COVID has made us so aware. And then the last thing, and this is a little wonkier, but this matters, and I was talking with Richard about how important this is, like broadly in policy, is we have a better understanding that delivery matters, right? It doesn't, in theory, like you can have great legislation on the books, you can have, economic policy that is the best policy according to theoretical economic models. But if the money doesn't get to people, if those eligible are barred from getting the benefits, well, you might as well have stayed home when it was time to write and pass the legislation, right? And a really good example, a very tragic example of this was the breakdown in our unemployment insurance system. It is the bedrock of the safety net for workers in recessions. And we've known for decades that this system has uh, a lot of holes in it. There are some parts of the country where it's under active attack and like watered down and making it difficult for workers. But even in states that really, try to get benefits to the unemployed, millions and millions of people were applying for jobless benefits every week last spring. And we still have, about a million applying each week now nationally. And that was an immense strain on the system. People spent hours, if not days, trying to get their claims even just registered. It took long to approve them. Workers were waiting weeks and weeks, sometimes months, to get their first benefits. That's really hard for families to do anything without a paycheck. But a lot of times it did get there for those who were eligible and who were able to make their claim. What I'm showing you in this chart is that missed a lot of people, right? About half of Americans, according to the Census Bureau, lost income from employment last year, due to in the COVID crisis, and only about 20% of Americans got some kind of jobless benefit. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people aren't eligible for them, and then a lot of people just don't get access. And you can see here in this chart, like this goes well up into the middle class, these gaps. And so where unemployment insurance is a well-targeted, it's exactly the kind of thing we get it to the unemployed, where something like stimulus checks go out broadly, some people get it, aren't going to need it, but those actually got to people. So if we want to have these like first best kind of programs, we have to make sure they actually work. And that's going to be true as we create new programs too. Got to make sure the delivery is like actually happening. Okay, so those were some of the awareness. Now, when we think about goals, and these are really important, and this is really exciting, right? Because you need to know there are problems, but then you've got to think about, okay, well, what would problem solved look like? Okay, so, and a really important one, and in particular, the Federal Reserve has picked this one up, is full employment. And while they don't have a definition of this, I really go back to the this was a long time ago, thinking about full employment after the New Deal, and the civil rights movement continued this. I mean, this was how the Fed got its maximum employment mandate. And really, I think, a pretty straightforward definition is everybody who wants to work has a job, and it's a job with a living wage, right? So this is, I mean, it's got to be a good job. And so, what the Federal Reserve, and this is a graphic, or in particular, this adjustment of the current unemployment rate is something the Federal Reserve has put forward. And what you can see here is we don't have a good track record of full employment, right, after a recession. So each of these is a different recession. And what I do is the lines are the unemployment rate quarter after quarter from the start of the recession relative to their pre-recession level, right? So, in this recession, you can see that the official unemployment rate jumped almost 10 percentage points, and an unemployment rate where we take into account these millions of workers who left the labor force and wouldn't be counted as unemployed if you rejigger that and say, well, they were working, they'd want to be working, they're not, so they're like unemployed, then you see that the unemployment rate jumped almost 16 percentage points. So this is massive relative to other recessions. But the thing that we have to pay attention to is getting back at least to where we started. And you can see in particular after the Great Recession, that just did not happen at all. And over time, like we can't do that again. That was extremely, extremely disruptive. Okay, so another goal that we've talked a lot about, but I think we're starting to see it operationalized a little bit more, is reducing inequality. And I think we all know at this point that there are big gaps in the pay of workers versus the CEOs. There are big gaps in income, especially like market income before you start having transfers and tax policy. And there's a lot of like wealth inequality is massive because it is the over time adding up of these income inequalities that we see. What is making it more possible to set goals, and like goals need numbers attached to them, is that we have more and more data that instead of just being the aggregates for the country as a whole, allow us to look at groups of families. So what I'm showing you here in this chart is compensation of US employees. This is a number that was reported today with GDP, the aggregate, right? And there's a lot of discussion about aggregate GDP, aggregate income is almost back on track. Now, a couple months ago, I heard this kind of talked about like, oh, compensation is almost there. We don't need to give more relief out. It'd be a waste of money. And at that point, we still had about 10 million workers who were like less jobs than before. And I was like, how can compensation be back on track? And these individual and we've got 10 million jobs missing. I was like, do these people make no money? I dug out this data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's relatively new data. This is actually for 2018. It takes them a while to update it. And lo and behold, a lot of low income people, basically, when you think about aggregates, make no money, right? And this is a massive indictment of the economy as a whole. You hear a lot of talk about, oh, work disincentives. People are getting an extra $300 a week if they're on unemployment benefits. Many of the low wage workers are making more money on unemployment than they would have on if they were on the job. And I mean, first of all, we have a lot of research that shows when the jobs are there, people do go back. I mean, working has a lot of benefits beyond just like the weekly paychecks. And it also says something deeply disturbing about our economy, that you have to lose your job and be lucky enough that the federal government has topped off unemployment benefits, and that's how you got a raise, right? Like, I think this is much more about low wage workers aren't paid enough as opposed to we're being too generous with unemployment benefits. And I think something like this shows that there's this massive difference across families. And I like to point out that many of the policymakers, many of us who have advanced degrees or getting those degrees, we tend to show up in one decile here. And it's the one all the way to the end that has a disproportionate share of income. And I think this is where we have to be very careful as policymakers and advisors to introspect on our situation, because it is not the situation of the people who fiscal policy, monetary policy will actually serve, especially if we have a full employment, reduce inequality goal. So I just think data like these are really important and striking, and they also give us an opportunity to set goalposts and to judge our progress. Okay, so the last one, and this is a shift that's particularly happening at the Fed. You'll hear if you listen to economic news, you'll hear a lot of discussion about inflation, overheating. Overheating is just when inflation gets out of control and starts spiraling up. You'll hear the Fed saying, no, we're not as worried about it. You will hear people like Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard and other inflation hawks say this is irresponsible what the Fed is doing, what the federal government's doing. The Fed, after its failure to reach its stable prices mandate ever since the Great Recession, rethought its framework. And basically now they want to see prices average 2%. And what I'm showing you here is to get there. So the gray line are these are the 12-month changes in inflation. That's kind of what the Fed focuses on. And it got really low last year because like in some months prices were falling. That's bad, right? That was about the time I was here last year. And we did start to see a recovery, but that recovery was like 1% inflation, nowhere near 2%. And month after month after month last year, we had this very low inflation. So the average inflation really got below 2%. So that's the blue line, kind of the average starting at the beginning of 2020. And what the Fed needs to get its target is to have inflation well above 2%, probably even above 3%. And we need it above 2 all year. And that is why the inflation hawks are just like going to squawk themselves. I mean, they're going to get so loud, it's going to be really even worse, more insufferable than now, because we've never seen these kind of numbers. And, I think there are risks and we should be concerned about it, but the Fed has been very clear and they thought about it for years, what was a way to get themselves back on track, get the economy back on track after a recession. Last thing, rising prices are not a bad thing right now. There were price declines last year that are like businesses can't continue to operate at those prices.
Excuse me,
Yeah,
Claudia,
go ahead.
just a clarification. Is this core CPI or all CPI?
No, what I'm showing you here is the personal consumption expenditure prices. So this is the total. The reason the Fed talks about core, their target is in total, right? Like we got to pay for food and energy, right? That's what's excluded from core. And like the Fed gets that. That's the whole thing. They care about the whole basket, like what consumers have to pay. The reason they talk about core is it gives us a better sense of where the total is going. Like food and energy do this a lot. And so really core, and that's just a statistical term, core, it's just the part of the total that forecasts the total best. That's all that is. It's just like a tool, but the target is in the total. Is that, I mean, this is a fine point that even like macroeconomists that should know better get it wrong. Actually, there's Fed officials that get this wrong.
So I'm just curious because I'm curious about the forecast and I should know this, but I don't at the moment. I mean, given that we have had a rise in energy prices in the last year, if we looked at core, what would these data look like? Would it be much different? Would it be higher? Would it be lower?
Well, so this first dot here, we're going to get tomorrow. So this was kind of me forecasting off of the CPI that we'd already had. The numbers tomorrow will show that total, because of gas prices rising and some food price increases, are going to be higher than the core.
Okay.
Right? But I think we have a pretty good sense that, gas prices will probably fall back some, so that pushes down on inflation, food, because these tend to be temporary.
Yeah.
But I think legitimately, like we're going to see totals, both core and total PC, that go pretty high. And so my forecast here is just to kind of like mentally prepare us for there are going to be some big numbers. And even with these big numbers, that blue line, the average, it doesn't even get back to 2. Right. So this is totally uncharted territory, and it's really causing a lot of like Fed versus market versus macro people discussions. So yeah, it's going to be an exciting year for the Fed. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm talking a lot here. Okay, so new approaches. So we've seen some of these have been implemented. Some of them have just gotten into the discourse in a way that frankly, I am surprised and heartened, because remember, I watched after the Great Recession us just falling so far short on monetary policy and fiscal policy. This time, there's a lot more going on, a lot more experimentation. So just as some big categories, we've seen cash transfers become like a real thing. Like we had 3 big stimulus payments, which I have worked on research showing that like this is a really good way to help households in recessions. Even I would not have believed, like if you told my 2008 self, and the rebates were going out then, oh, in this next recession we're going to have twice as big and they're going to be 3 times. I mean, I was just like, wow. And then what we've seen in this last package is they put this regular child benefit, which is just a cash transfer. It only goes, for like per children in a family, and it's for everybody except like very high income, just like the stimulus checks. That is essentially basic income for kids, right? So we have moved into this like just giving people money and letting them do what they want to do, as opposed to like, taxes and things to incentivize certain spending. So that's a big change. We've had a really big change on like how much deficit spending is appropriate, how much federal debt. And while we haven't seen like modern monetary theory, just like universal basic income, is kind of into the continuum of more and more like how much do deficits matter or not matter. And that is a discussion, just like universal basic income, that was well outside of the mainstream even just like less than 5 years ago, and is now totally in the discussion. That's pretty exciting. And we're making a big push. This isn't necessarily new, but in terms of getting more education and filling in the gaps, both at like post-secondary training and college, free community college is in the family's plan, as well as at the very beginning. So the pre-K, the daycare, making that accessible, affordable for everyone. Like, so that's a big deal. That also is in family's plan. And then we've had discussions. There's been a lot of discussions around student loan forgiveness and just in general how we fix this very broken financing of higher education, as I'm sure all of you who have student loans understand and are watching that debate carefully. And then the Fed, I've actually talked a lot about the first two pieces. So the Fed is trying to elevate its maximum employment mandate so that it's on par with its stable prices mandate. To do that, and to make sure that they actually achieve the stable prices mandate, this is where they are rethinking how they want to approach inflation. The biggest change, and this like comes from the average, but it's a little wonky how to trace pull the thread through. But what they've said is now we're only going to react after we've seen inflation. And always in the past, they have reacted when they expected inflation. So you can imagine how the hawks get very problematic because they are all about it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And the Fed used to have that like approach, and there are Fed officials who still like, in their heart of hearts, that's how they feel. So now they're saying we're not going to do that. We're going to wait until we see inflation and then we'll react. So that is a huge change, and is again creating a lot of discussion. The last thing the Fed has done, and we talked about racial injustice as part of the awareness. I mean, you obviously see this in the fiscal policy. The Fed is very new to this game, not game, but new to this awareness of racial equity and the role they play both in improving it and making it worse, which they definitely had a role in that after the Great Recession. And so they're really grappling with how their mandates can be applied or how they can think about marginal groups as the goals. And then, I mean, they're just trying to diversify their leadership, not doing super great on that, but at least they're trying. Okay, so I talked a lot about new, right? Like we got new awareness, new policies, new tools. One thing that's important in all of this, is some of the new is like old, but we're bringing it back, right? And it's important as we do this to bring back things that work. I think last night, if you were listening to President Biden's address, he talked about how supply side economics, trickle down economics, in his opinion, I think a lot of other people's opinions, didn't work. So we're like trying to set that aside. So what do you bring into its place? So I think what we're seeing right now is a shift to very activist fiscal policy. And this is about spending, not just cutting taxes, or in this, like what they're going to do right now is proposing to raise taxes to help pay for more spending. And you have to go back in time to really see big activist fiscal policy, regardless. I mean, since the 70s, regardless if it was a Republican or a Democratic administration, the activism on the fiscal, like on spending, was pretty not that much. So if you look back, though, we do have periods in our history. The New Deal, which followed the Great Depression. Post World War II, we had a lot of programs to help support veterans and families. And then in the Great Society, we had a lot of measures to try and begin to address the systemic racism in a lot of ways in the economy and the society. So like you have to go back to these times to really find the government trying to do like big, like what they're doing right now. So, but that's tricky. Like we don't live in the 1930s anymore, right? So the solutions then won't necessarily be solutions now. And it's not like all that was old was really that great. A lot of programs that were put in place, like the unemployment insurance, were discriminatory from the very start. They excluded domestic workers, agricultural workers, which in sectors in which Black and brown people disproportionately worked. So like we got some, even when the government was trying to do something good, they weren't doing good for everyone. So, take the good, leave the bad. One of the things that I've worked a lot on, and I'm very encouraged to see part of this made it into the families plan, or at least the proposal, is automatic stabilizers. So this is where you take safety net programs like the unemployment insurance. You could also do these with stimulus checks, and you tie them to economic conditions. So ahead of the recession, Congress says, if the unemployment rate starts to rise, we're going to send out the checks. We're going to bump up the unemployment insurance benefits. Like there's a plan to fight the recession. And then as the unemployment rate gets close to where it was before the recession, those benefits taper off and then they stop. And Congress has to, they have to pass that legislation. The idea is you pass it ahead of the recession, and then you don't have to rely on Congress coming together and passing these packages. Now, every recession has things that are different. Congress will still have a lot of work to do. You could imagine the relief packages that that Congress has, the 3 packages over the past year, instead of arguing about who gets a stimulus check, how is it $600, is it $300 a week for the jobless? Well, all that could be figured out, and then they could have spent a lot more time on COVID, maybe some of the housing crisis issue, like very specific things that were happening. The Great Recession would have been the same thing, finding solutions for underwater borrowers. So, but you can take the stuff that we always do and put it on autopilot, and then people know it's coming, and we can set up the administrative systems ahead of time so they work. So that would be good. And when, as I mentioned before, we are getting into this safety net is more about providing cash and less about tax incentives. This is important. Like over time, and again, this was across different administrations, when welfare reform happened, we kept moving towards we'll give families benefits if they work, right? And so it was a very like, we're going to kind of, this is a little, I mean, not a little, this is a form of control from policymakers into families' lives about how they should be working or not working. And if you don't work, we're not giving you money. We're into a space of a lot more cash transfers that obviously you just give people money, you empower them to do it. You got to deal with the fact that some of them aren't going to do what you think is the best use of that money. One benefit of it is that that money can go out very broadly. We saw this with the stimulus checks. It can reach people that just aren't working or in the like in that system. So it has the ability to address some of the very deep poverty problems in the country. But I mean, this is a big change from how we've done economic policy over the past several decades. So, but we have, I mean, these safety nets and cash transfers and welfare, like this, we have a history of doing it this way. Okay, So here's my dismal slide. I've only got a couple more. I promise the last one is not quite this bad. I think I'm very encouraged by this moment. Again, having seen policy go completely off the rails after the Great Recession. And really, it was the recovery that was so heartbreaking, because it wasn't much of a recovery for many people until years and years into it. And then having watched the COVID crisis, which was just, tragic on so many dimensions, to see the conversation changing is really heartening. Now, I am a macroeconomist, and given this life experience as a macroeconomist, I like to say I have become now pathologically pessimistic. And so when I look at all of this that's happening, all this opportunity for change, I would encourage you not to hold your breath, right? There's a big, we could have a sea change in economic policy, but it doesn't have to happen, right? Okay, so as I said in the beginning, change has enemies, right? So the old guard, and you see it particularly in economics, and I mentioned some of this with the inflation hawks, are fighting, not in a, in terms of words and data and research, and largely experiences from the 70s and 80s, are fighting to retain their power. And their power in terms of economic policy frameworks and thinking. And so this is about inflation. Don't let it get out of control. Targeting, have these really pinpointed programs, and small government. And even, what I would consider maybe left of center economists have for a long time felt, keep Congress out of it. They're too political. They're going to make the bad choices. Let the Fed do it. Right. So this also has a small government aspect, and that really just fell totally on its face in the Great Recession. But it changes hard, and there are people that don't want change. And okay, so there's them. Got to deal with them. Then to do these changes, change is an opportunity, but it's also a risk. For example, if this child benefit, these regular cash transfers, that would be a big change in how we support families with children. We have no idea when those first benefits are going out, right? The administration of those benefits is, well, frankly, I don't think it was very well thought out, right? And they're asking the Internal Revenue Service to administer those. They do not have the setup or the bandwidth to do it. So if that, this is past legislation, has been promised to people. There are a lot of families that would like to get that money. If it doesn't get out, there's going to be disappointment and backlash. And it'd be so you have a really good intended policy and it's on the books, but it's not in people's pockets. And we don't even have good research and data to give us a sense of what those kind of benefits will do, because we've never done them, especially on a large scale. So it's exciting to see us moving ahead, full speed ahead. It is, as someone who is a big proponent of evidence-based policymaking that policies that actually work in the real world and not just in paper and not just in theory. This also makes me a little nervous, because policy is moving really fast, and the thinking and the evidence behind it is kind of catching up right now. So we'll see about that. And then the last thing, and this is the piece I have somewhat, I have the hardest time with some of the messaging out of the administration and Congress. I'm always concerned about raising expectations beyond what we can deliver, false hopes. And I think we saw that a lot with COVID last year, where we were told COVID was just going to go away and it'd be all better, and it wasn't. And what we're seeing now is the administration has put some really big goals in their sights, fighting systemic racism, climate change, deep poverty, addressing gender inequities in the economy. They proposed two $2 trillion bill. So another $4 trillion is not going to end any of these, right? All we can hope is we get some momentum going, that the money is well spent. But yeah, these are gonna be hard, but they're fights worth fighting. Like, these need to be addressed. Which leads me to the last slide, and setting all these difficulties aside, setting all of the details that are still up in the air, like, this change has to happen, right? Like, this is a moral imperative. The awareness has been raised. If we don't act on it, it is an even greater indictment of policymakers, just Americans in general. Like, this just should not be happening. This last photograph that I'm leaving you with is a tent encampment that is, like, the Federal Reserve building is just kind of back through those trees. I walk by these tents every single day on my way from the metro back and forth when I worked at the Fed. There are many more tents in this small kind of public park space than there were, when I left the Fed in 2019. Jay Powell has mentioned this group of individuals in this community of individuals living homeless. And this has been held up as an example of, we can't afford to fail, because we're going to be failing people that deserve so much more than what they have right now. So, okay, so that is the prepared remarks I have. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Oh, there we go. Sorry, need my glasses.
Claudia, thank you very much for you said that this was kind of a dress rehearsal, but a really well prepared and well organized and thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to take my prerogative and ask you two questions, and I'll turn. I see Maisha has a question, then maybe some others too. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to divide it into a wonky question and a distinctly not wonky question. So the wonky question is, as you were talking, I was thinking about my favorite address to the American Economic Association by a president, which was by Mr. Janet Yellen, also known as George Akerlof, where he talked about the 5 totems of macroeconomics that just didn't work. So he said, and again, audience, forgive me for what I'm about to say, but rational expectations doesn't work. Ricardian doctrine doesn't work. Modigliani-Miller doesn't work. And that was, I think, just before the global financial crisis that he gave that address. I think it was in 2006, 2007, something like that. So I thought its prescience was quite remarkable after the fact. But I remember when I read it, I thought, yes, this is sort of what I've been waiting for my whole life on macro. But that said, and it could just reflect that I haven't internalized it well, but modern macro theory doesn't really float my boat either as an analytical framework for thinking about doing things. Now, one of the things I have admired about you all these years is you are a really good forecaster, which means that, and as I said, I should have given a shout out to the Sahm Rule at the introduction. I did it a year ago, which is so Claudia has come up with the metric for telling us that we are in fact in a recession, which was something that was very elusive for decades. Go back to the time of Arthur Kuznets when we first really started doing these things formally. And so you clearly have an analytical framework in your head when you think about the impact of policy X on outcome Y. Can you describe a little bit what, I know I'm putting you a little on the spot here, but how do you think about these things? How do you come to the answers that you come to?
Yeah, well, I would say I am very fortunate in the training that I've had throughout my career as an economist, right? So at the Federal Reserve, I learned to do macro forecasting from the best. And I learned at a time where I needed to learn really fast. Like, I learned, probably a decade of forecasting within 3 years, right? Just because so much was happening in the economy. At the Federal Reserve, the economists are also given time and resources to do research. While I am a macro forecaster, all of my research, well, for a very long time, all of my research was applied micro. So I did survey studies of the 2008 tax rebates, 2009 and 10 making work pay credit. So all of these different policies to households, I've done research on. We ran our survey for the 2020 checks, the first checks, and we have one in the field right now for the $1,400 checks. And so I think, and having focused on consumers, like I've always been very in tune with not just aggregate spending, but spending at different household levels. My last 2 years at the board, I was in a division that focused on low and moderate income consumers and communities. I think one of the things that distinguishes me from a lot of macroeconomists, a lot of the academics can't forecast. I mean, that does distinguish me too from them, in very real world data, is that I get it that the aggregates tell us something, but they often don't tell us enough. And sometimes, like right now, they can be misleading as to what's really happening in the economy. Now, I'm not the only one that's pushing this. There, in academic macro and in macro research, there is a really exciting area, what's called distributional macro. Sounds totally sleep inducing. But what it is it's taking macroeconomic models and being able to look both at aggregates and how the economy adjusts, and to look at different groups of households. And so I think, we're getting the tools and the data to really change. And there's a lot of people that relax your rational expectations, assumptions, and these things make a difference.
Not mine. I mean, as I said, Akerlof.
Well, no, address your concern. Like you said, you don't like that, right?
Yeah.
And I do, none of these theories are perfect. Like George Akerlof is one of the most creative economists we have. He's been very quiet recently. We could use some backup here, but he probably can't talk because his wife kind of.
I was going to say he probably
a rather
has.
political.
There's probably a reason he's quiet.
But we need more people like him pushing, because I think Paul Krugman has a book out. I think it came out last year, and he talks about the zombies of macro, and there are certain macroeconomic models, there are certain frameworks and thinking that just they have been disproven for decades and they will not go away. So we got to figure out a way to crowd them out with good stuff.
Well, I mean, and I forgot the most important of the 5 that he debunked was the representative Asian theory. And again, you go back to Angus Deaton stuff. He showed that micro foundation models for macro don't work unless you have assumptions that are so strong that they can't possibly be true. Now I'm really going to get in trouble. Homotheticity of preferences, stuff like that. Yep. So, no, I think your point about thinking about the economy on a, shall we say, household by household basis instead of in aggregates is incredibly important, and it explains why your stuff turns out as well as it does. The more practical question, it gets to the issue of inequities. And as you know, one of my frustrations is how housing has contributed to this. And it's not just that it contributed to it a long time ago, as it did with the FHA program and which had redlining and the way we did exclusionary zoning and continue to do it and so on. But even recently, you go back, 2009 was the best time to buy a house in the last 35 years in the US. And who couldn't get access to mortgage credit? African Americans and Latinos, because they were disproportionately harmed by the subprime crisis. So here was an opportunity to buy a house at a reasonable price, even in California. And you couldn't, because if you were Black, if you were Latino, disproportionately, because you couldn't get access to credit. And now this is been the best time ever to refinance a mortgage, and an important channel of economic stimulus. Roddy Ramcharan has done great here at USC, who used to be at the Fed, has done great work on this. But if you were African American or Latino, you were more likely to have lost your job, and the thing you needed in order to get a refinance was have a job. So how can we, again, I'm afraid I'm putting you on the spot here, but how can we change policy so that we stop repeating these things that continue to compound the inequities that have happened over the years? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have policies that go straight at the inequities, right? So you can't have race blind policies, right? There are some, like getting a full employment economy, getting a recovery as fast as possible, that is going to benefit marginalized workers, right? Like you got to get us back as quickly as possible. Wealth building primarily comes from income, right? But especially when we think about wealth, the disparities have built over decades and generations. And so you really have to think about not reparations is one proposal that people like Sandy Darity have talked about, but even if you don't go that far, it's like thinking about corrective measures. And there was one that I thought was really interesting that was in the relief plan. It was a small program, but I think this is an example of the kind of policy discussions, and I think there'll be a lot of pushback too, is there was a program specifically for Black farmers in getting agricultural credit, because it had been well documented that there were discriminatory practices even up until recently, so a little different than housing. And they said this money is for Black farmers. Now you can imagine that caused, even though it's a small program, a lot of pushback from other people, right? But those are the kind of programs that we have to be able to figure out a way to push them through. And this is only going to be levered on a real awareness of systemic economic injustice. But like we have never pulled that off, right? Because then there'll be pushback and backlash. So they're tough. And national policies like what the Fed does, like they can't target the Black unemployment rate. They can pay a lot of attention to it and they can push really hard, but that's where, especially in wealth space, like housing, like that's just, I don't know. I'll be very interested to hear your ideas. But you do see the administration trying. Like there are programs like extending broadband internet access. That has a big rural benefit, but it also to a lot of inner cities is a benefit, or making sure we have safe drinking water and no lead pipes. Like those benefits will go disproportionately to Black and brown people and communities. It's just how much can they really push that, and can they really get that stuff passed is a big question mark.
So Chase, Maisha has a question. I think I'd like her to ask it. Can we make her a participant? Because I think Claudia largely answered the question that you typed into the chat, but I wanted to make sure that if there was nuance I missed, that you expressed it.
Oh yeah, thanks so much, and Dr. Green, and this is a wonderful just discussion. Just to reiterate what you said earlier, as a Sahm rule, it makes sense, of course, to me and to I think a lot of people who kind of look at our current system as being completely unequal, and the disparities that have been kind of light has been shed on just for COVID-19 and our unrest just recently. So it makes sense to me, but I'm not an economist. So when you're introducing these new things, these kind of revolutionary things that actually would benefit larger society as well as the groups suffering these disparities, you're going to get a lot of pushback. And I think I put in the post or in the chat that I watched The Man in the White Suit, which is kind of an interesting movie about change makers. So how do you it's such a huge issue, changing our policy. How do you do that? I guess that's my question is, how do you get started? How would an average person, an economist and an average person kind of go about starting to make those changes, starting to actually steer our economy and our country in the right direction?
Yeah, so I think, obviously this is hard. These goals are really lofty, really important goals. I think the biggest thing that policymakers can hope for right now is getting some momentum going. Right, the federal government cannot bring this to the finish line. It really does require communities and families and the private sector to all pitch in, and we all got to get the incentives. Like we all got to want this and work towards it. And that's going to be hard, I think, for the federal government getting the ball rolling. And I am very big on well-designed, well-administered policies, right? We sometimes get like the signing party is really exciting and we got great talking points, but like the details matter. And I think that's one where I think as a government, we fall short on. and definitely policy advisors. We don't spend enough time thinking about that. In terms of people, this goes on both sides. Policymakers have to get people at the table. They have to listen to people who are outside of Washington, D.C., and people have to trust that it is worth raising their voices, right? We have a long history of not paying attention to people, what they actually need. So I think there's a lot of really exciting activism that is going on a lot of spectrums. I mean, they're even, Fed Up is a activist group pushing on the Federal Reserve to do better, right? So there's all these different spaces where people can step up and really explain what they need, what they're seeing. But that also takes time, and it's not like the payoffs have been huge in the past. So I think there's kind of these relationships are important to build, but with measured expectations.
So we have one last question from Brian Jones. And he's just asking, are there other countries that we could look at that have used direct payments, and how well to a group of people with incomes below some threshold, and how well has it worked, if so?
Yeah. So we do on the direct payments, we have a lot of evidence even from the United States. So if you think about the stimulus checks, particularly in recessions, there's research, I've done this, others have, that it's effectiveness. If you get into a space of the more like the child credits I was talking about, or basic income, basic, like the guaranteed income, okay, then we are moving out of like US as an example. For child benefit, like most of Europe does this. I mean, the United States is really an outlier in the way that we support families and children. So we have a lot of evidence that is an important, it means a lot to those families. In more like like more universal type income support programs as a way to deal with deep poverty, or just to, kind of support people in kind of, living their daily lives or investing in their future. There are experiments happening right now. And both in the United States, in some communities, there's been private funding for payments, and they do, tests of like some people get them, some people don't. There are countries, I think Brazil is one that's been experimenting with that. So this is one where I feel like the policy conversation is running ahead of the evidence, but the evidence is catching up, right? So we do have, and I agree, we need to look at other countries. It's tricky, right? Because the United States is special in many ways relative to the rest of the world. And even as I mentioned some of the historical examples, the United States in 2021 is very different than the United States in 1935, right? So, but we need to I love every scrap of data, every piece of research, every experiment we can find. It's just, you have to be able to filter it. And at the end of the day, it's applying some degree of judgment as an analyst to what applies. And then there comes judgment from people, like, is this what we need? And then you got to actually do it properly. But yeah, there's a lot of examples, and there are a lot of really good examples of how to fight recession, like the automatic stabilizers. A lot of other countries, and especially in Europe, have much better ways where they start fighting recessions right away. They keep workers attached to their employers. So there's a lot of lessons we could learn, but frankly, we could have learned them a long time ago. So the United States is kind of a go our own way kind of country, but we absolutely have others to learn from, and the United States has led on policies too. So it goes both ways.
So we're at the top of the hour. Claudia Sahm, thank you so much for coming back and sharing some of your wisdom with us. I hope we can persuade you into joining us again.
Yeah, of course.
Again, Claudia, thanks so much for being here. Great seeing you. Audience, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Lusk Perspectives.